Hello everyone, my name is Craig Adler. I am a retired certified financial planner. I'm also sometimes known as the Angry Financial Planner. In today's video, my goal is to answer 3 questions for you about the Schwab Dividend Equity Fund. Those 3 questions are: 1. Is the Schwab Dividend Equity Fund a terrible investment? Question number 2. What were the key factors associated with that fund that drove its abysmal 2025 performance? And lastly, if you do own that fund today, what you should do or what you should consider going forward. Let's go ahead and start with the first question, which is the Schwab Dividend Equity Fund a terrible investment? If we base that decision, or if we attempt to answer that question using just the annualized return from 2025, I am not sure what other conclusion we could draw other than this. And that is, from that data alone, it does look like the Schwab Dividend Equity Fund is a terrible investment. In 2025, that fund earned slightly more than 4%. If we compare that to a total market index fund, total market index funds in 2025 earned 17%, 13% more than the Schwab fund. Even if we compare it to the Vanguard Dividend Appreciation Fund, ticker symbol VIG, which it frequently gets compared to, the Schwab fund underperformed by 10%. So if we base the answer to the question, is the Schwab Dividend Equity Fund a terrible investment, exclusively off of annual performance from 2025, I am not sure what other conclusion we could draw other than it does appear to be a terrible investment. But I think all of us know there are many factors that we need to evaluate to determine the suitability and the appropriateness of a mutual fund. So what I'm going to do now is I am going to look at the structure of the Schwab Dividend Equity Fund so we can determine what exactly drove that performance, and hopefully that structural information will help us either validate or reject our current conclusion, which is the Schwab Dividend Equity Fund, at least based on performance, appears to be very seriously flawed. There are numerous structural components that we could look at. I am going to look at 3. The first one is what's called style analysis, and we're going to look at the ratio of growth investments to value investments. The second structural component we are going to look at is something called market capitalization. Are the companies owned by the Schwab fund large cap, mid cap, or small cap? And then the final consideration we are going to look at is sector allocation. Sectors are essentially industry classifications, things like energy, technology, and healthcare. We are going to look at those 3 structures. So let's go ahead and start with style analysis, which is really the ratio of growth stocks to value stocks. When we look at the style of the Schwab Dividend Equity Fund, it has almost 100% of its money in value investments. It essentially has no growth exposure, and 86% of its investments are pure value based. When we compare this to a broad market index like the Total Stock Market Index Fund, most total stock market index funds are only 30% pure value. That means the Schwab fund has almost 3 times as much money in value exposure than a broad-based total market index. Unfortunately, that decision did not help the Schwab fund in 2025 because growth outperformed value by about 2%. The other consideration we're going to look at is, from a structural perspective, is the size exposure, large cap, mid cap, and small cap. And here the structural changes are not quite as significant, but what we do find is the Schwab fund underweighted large cap exposure by about 10% and redistributed those funds to mid cap and small cap. That decision to underweight large cap stocks also hurt the Schwab fund. And the reason why is this: large cap stocks outperformed mid cap and small cap by about 6 and 13% respectively. Even though growth in value and capitalization had a negative impact on the Schwab fund, the real concern comes from the sector allocation. When we look closely at the sector allocation of the Schwab Dividend Equity Fund, there are certain things that we will notice almost right away. The first thing is this: it significantly underweighted technology. It took technology exposure down from 33% down to 10%. It then redistributed that money into energy, moving it from about 3% from a broad-based fund to 20% for the Schwab fund. It did something similar with consumer exposure, increasing it from 5% to 18%. So at a qualitative level, what the Schwab fund did was it sold technology and bought energy and consumer goods equity securities. Unfortunately, that was a terrible decision to make. And the reason why is technology was one of the top 2 performing sectors in 2025, and energy and consumer goods were the worst. The real problem, the main driver of Schwab's underperformance, comes down to its sector allocations. So here's where we're at now in the video. Based on performance alone, it would be safe to conclude that the Schwab Dividend Equity Fund is not an ideal investment. But then when we take it further and we look at the structural changes associated with that fund compared to a broad-based index, that actually validates that conclusion. But here's where we need to be careful about coming to that final conclusion that the Schwab Dividend Equity Fund is a terrible fund. And here's why we need to be careful. The Schwab Dividend Equity Fund is a passively managed fund. It is an index fund. There was no manager out there actively making those decisions. The fund tracks the underlying index, which it does extremely well. The real problem with the Schwab Dividend Equity Fund is not the structure of the fund, but rather something called tracking error. Tracking error is how its performance is going to vary compared to broad-based index, which should be our core portfolio holdings. Now, when that tracking error is large and positive, meaning the funds that we've selected have outperformed broad-based index funds, we feel we made this brilliant decision. Unfortunately, when we underperform with the decisions that we make, we tend to make bad psychological and emotional decisions. The Schwab Dividend Equity Fund, its allocations were not the problem. The problem is when we purchased that fund, we introduced tracking error into our portfolio. And unfortunately, in 2025, that error manifested itself in a very large and significant way. The real solution is don't introduce tracking error into your portfolio. That is what we need to avoid. Now what I want to address is what should we do if we are still holding that fund? In my opinion, as time horizons lengthen, negative tracking error will sometimes mitigate itself. It will tend to disappear, meaning the Schwab Dividend Equity Fund and the broad-based indexes that we might be comparing it to, the rates of return should move closer as the time horizon lengthens. How long that is going to take and how much that gap is going to close is anyone's guess. But if I had a relatively small position in that fund, I would probably keep it. If my position was larger, I would probably sell off small amounts every year, reallocate that money into broad-based, highly diversified index funds. I hope you found this video beneficial and helpful. New subscribers are always a wonderful treat, but my primary goal is to create videos that improve your financial literacy. And remember, when it comes to our money, it is always better to be educated than angry.